It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who's Gabriella, or she goes by Biella, Coleman, who's the Wolf Chair in Scientific and Technological Literacy at McGill University in Quebec. She managed to get out just ahead of an ice storm. Trained as an anthropologist, her scholarship focuses on the intersection of hacker culture and politics, with a focus on the free software movement and the digital protest group Anonymous. She's very well published. She's authored a book called Coding Freedom, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Hacking, Princeton University Press, and more recently, Hacker, Hoaxer, Whistleblower, Spy, The Many Faces of Anonymous, published by Verso. That book was named to the Kirkus Review's Best Books of 2014 and was awarded the 2015 Diana Forsyth Prize, which is given by the American Anthropological Association. She's a frequent commentator on hacker movements, digital culture, and cyber politics. She's written for popular media, including the New York Times, Slate, Wired, Huffington Post, and the Atlantic Monthly. Please join me in giving a great, warm Santa Fe welcome to Biella Coleman.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. All right, well, first of all, thank you for that introduction, and thanks to everyone at SAR who got me here. I just ran a workshop last week in Montreal, and I'm very happy to not be on the end of the organizing part of things. I know it takes so much work, and thanks to also the donors that made this possible. So I'm going to jump in. So the title of my talk is How Anonymous Narrowly Evaded Being Vilified as Terrorists. And some of you in the audience have probably heard about Anonymous, but with a name like Anonymous, if you have not heard about them, you're probably wondering who they are and what they've done. So what I'm going to do right now is just give a little bit of an introduction, but as I move on in the talk, you'll get a better sense of what they've done and who they are. So today, the name Anonymous is used by different groups of people. Some of them are connected, some of them are not connected, around the world to organize very different forms of collective action. They're most famous for computer hacking, so breaking into a computer system and maybe taking some data, but they've done many other things. They've organized street protests, they've worked with journalists, they've worked with technologists to bring human rights technology assistance to social movements around the world. Now, what's interesting about Anonymous is that in the past, the name Anonymous was not used for political purposes or activism, but for internet pranking and trolling. And in 2008, there was a metamorphosis when they were trolling the Church of Scientology and basically got on a path towards activism. It's a fascinating story that I can't really get into, but that was the period of time that I started to study them. So from 2010 onward, the name was used increasingly for political purposes. And wherever I go, whether it's New Mexico or Berlin, usually I could show a video of an anonymous action being taken in that place. So to just give you a little bit of sense of what they are and who they are, I'm going to show you a quick video from an action they took in Albuquerque.
Greetings, city of Albuquerque. We are Anonymous. Recently, a video has been released to the public which shows Albuquerque police officers murdering a man in cold blood for illegally camping. This man, which was schizophrenic, obviously had no intention of hurting these police officers. On the contrary, this man looks as if he is simply attempting to protect himself from visually fierce militarized thugs. Whether this man had a history of crime is irrelevant. We drastically need to address the growing police state that has occupied our country. When will we say no more? How many more citizens will be murdered? Naturally, the APD will attempt to label Anonymous as a terrorist organization for our demands of justice. But the question has to be asked, who do we terrorize? Is it not a growing police state that terrorizes its own citizens? APD, you now have the full attention of Anonymous. To the citizens of Albuquerque, it's time to organize. On March 30th, we are asking the citizens of Albuquerque to occupy the APD HQ and occupy the sites of the Albuquerque Police Department.
So some of you might have seen this video or seen a news article about this action. Again, it was a more local one. that made some national headlines. Now, what I've included up here are a couple of words that I've used in my writing, in my talks, to describe Anonymous. So I've used the terms hydra, trickster, confusing, enchanting, anti-celebrity. They really are against people seeking fame and attention for what they do. They're very anti-surveillance or controversial. They're irreverent, interesting, wondrous, enchanting, unpredictable, frustrating, stupid, and sometimes really stupid. But one thing that actually I haven't had to do when writing and speaking about Anonymous, in spite of the video that you just watched, which raised the question of terrorism, is I haven't really had to argue that they're not terrorists, that they're not cyber terrorists. And I actually think this is interesting because I do think they were in a good position to possibly be painted with this label. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk, now that I've given a little bit of an introduction to who Anonymous is, and again, you'll learn a bit more as I go on, I want to first give you some proof that they escaped such vilification. Then I'll talk a little bit about why it was conceivable to paint them with that terrorism brush, and then really concentrate on why they evaded the few attempts that were in fact made to paint them with that terrorism label. So let's just jump in. I'm going to start with signs that they're not really associated with terrorism. And I think one of the most important ones has to do with the fact that the journalistic world has written quite a bit about Anonymous. In fact, Anonymous wouldn't have its power would it not be for a lot of journalists in places like New Mexico or big-time journalists in NBC and CNN had they not written about Anonymous. And most news articles refer to them as activists or hacktivists, with very few referring to them as terrorists. The most negative label you'll get is vigilantes. And every once in a while, there has been that term. It usually comes from Fox News, if it does happen. And very, very rarely are they portrayed as a dark, evil menace. So that's kind of one bit of proof. Another one actually is both proof that they haven't been painted as terrorists, and is also a kind of form of inoculation, preventing them from being painted as terrorists, and it has to do with pop culture. Anonymous has been the basis for so many Hollywood stories and movies and other forms of art. And what I'm going to do right now is just kind of show you two examples. One is a kind of big-name Hollywood one that took on big motifs from Anonymous, and another is a kind of more esoteric example. And later on, I'll give more examples as well. But I think a lot of the ways that Anonymous was picked up in pop culture was quite positive and never really as terrorists. So probably the most famous example in the United States is a show called Mr. Robots, which some of you might have heard of, about a disgruntled hacker, Elliot, who worked for a corporation and would do a lot of hacking on the side. And a lot of the motifs and themes were really directly from the world of Anonymous and kind of mirrored some of the sentiments of the world of hacktivism and Anonymous. And so now the next example I'm going to give is a bit more esoteric. And it's not so much about Anonymous, but about how certain people see hacktivism today. Anonymous is not only about hacktivism, but it tends to be really associated with hacktivism. And generally, hacktivists, again, are controversial, but are not quite seen as terrorists, and in many quarters are painted in a pretty positive way. And I think the next video of RuPaul and John Waters being a famous director and actor, really gets at that.
Do you meet kids, young people today who have that same irreverent sense of humor? And how have they changed?
I think they're having just as much fun being bad as I did in the 60s. I don't think we had more fun than they do. It's new. If you're a rebel today, you're sitting, you live with your parents, They haven't seen you in 6 months. They put food outside your bedroom door, and you're shutting down the governments of different countries on your computer.
Right.
That's how you'd rebel today. You'd be a hacker.
Yeah.
And I always say, I want a hacker boyfriend, except they have bad posture.
All right, and so again, we're going to get to some more pop cultural representations later that really take up hacktivism anonymous. But now I want to try to give you a sense of why they could have been vilified. And there's kind of two levels of analysis. One has to do with the fact that the use of the terrorism label has been used to contain, constrain, and rob power of all sorts of political movements and individuals past and present, and will likely continue in the future. Now, this is, of course, not to say that there isn't terrorists in the world, and in fact, terrorism by ISIS will come up later in my talk, but nevertheless, the label has been used, as many people know, for these political purposes. And when I give this lecture to my students, I start with my next example, which they all tend to be shocked by, which is the fact that Nelson Mandela, for example, was on a terrorist watch list both in the United States and in the UK for much of the 80s and 90s. And of course, today he is lauded and put on a pedestal, but this is a great example of the terrorism label being used against an individual for a period of time in two different countries. Now, there's many different examples. I've actually collected many different examples throughout the United States and Europe of different political groups being labeled terrorists, and so if you have any, send them my way. I'm not going to give you the full collection, just a couple of examples. But in the United States, Black Lives Matters, which is a movement to fight police brutality, interestingly enough, is one in which there were FBI agents who have considered Black Lives Matters as a kind of form of black identity extremists that pose a violent threat. This was based on some leaked documents that were given to journalists. Interestingly enough, there was a kind of grassroots movement to label Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization, and there was a petition that was launched that did receive 100,000 signatures. Another example that I like has to do with puppeteers in Spain who were jailed for a period of time for hailing terrorists. Eventually, they were freed. And again, there were many, many examples, but actually, most of the recent cases, the Black Lives Matter, the Spanish puppeteers, a handful of other examples that I've collected, they also haven't stuck. But I would like to give an example of a group that I do think was successfully labeled as terrorists in the United States, and it's animal rights activists. And this is a pretty complicated story as to how this happened, and in a second I'm going to refer to a book that has really looked at this in depth. But just to give you a taste of how serious the FBI took animal rights activism and kind of portrayed them as terrorists, here's a quote from 2004, which says, in 2004, John Lewis, Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI Counterterrorism Division, declared in testimony to the Senate Judiciary Committee the FBI's investigation of animal rights extremists and eco-terrorism matters is our highest domestic terrorism investigative priority. And there's a very, very good book called Green is the New Red by Will Potter, who's a journalist who basically became a target of the FBI simply for handing out leaflets related to environmental politics and animal rights activists. And in his book, he looks at how animal rights activists, many of whom definitely engaged in pretty radical acts of sabotage, how they were kind of portrayed and straitjacketed as terrorists. And so this is a couple of quotes from his book where he says, since September 11th, the word terrorism has been stretched and pulled and hemmed and cuffed and torn and mended to fit a growing body of political whims, and monkey wrencher saboteur are now the same as terrorists. And again, how this came into being is a pretty complicated story, but central to this successful labeling had to do with the fact that a certain law in the United States, the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, became the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. So, for example, some individuals who simply have liberated minks have been convicted under a terrorist act. And while not everyone sees them as terrorists, when a law kind of convicts you as a terrorist, it becomes a little bit harder to disassociate yourself from that term. So that's, of course, a general trend, the misuse of the terrorism label. But now I want to go into more specific details about Anonymous and why they, as a kind of protest movement related to hacking, could have been labeled as terrorists. So there's a long-standing cyber warfare and cyber terrorism frame that has kind of come out of certain circles of the US government for many decades now. Certain policy thinkers have been claiming that we will one day see a cyber Pearl Harbor, where there's such a huge attack against, let's just say, the electrical grid, that hospitals won't have power and will lead to the loss of life. And so this has been a concern in the United States for a very long time, at least since the 1990s. So this is a report about cyber risk in the information age from 1991. And the last line is the one I'll read, which says, "The modern thief can steal more with a computer than with a gun. Tomorrow's terrorist may be able to do more damage with a keyboard than with a bomb." So again, for about 20 years, the US government has been saying cyber terrorism is a threat, even though there hasn't been a kind of act of cyber terrorism yet. Anonymous could have maybe been that actor who fulfilled that fear. And that's because Anonymous was engaging in some really high-risk hacking and sabotage. And by sabotage, I mean some hackers within Anonymous would break into a corporation, would take the emails, post the emails online to find the politically damning information, and then delete all the other data that existed in the company. So this was some really high-risk stuff. Again, not all Anonymous operations were like that, but there were a handful in 2011 and 12 that took this form. And I'm going to read a quote by Cory Doctorow, who is a science fiction writer, and this is how he describes Anonymous. So in the kind of hacking that Anonymous does by means of the fluid structuralist norms of the group, half macho posturing, half uber-savvy media prankstership is doubly exciting, or exciting squared. It's filled with drama, betrayals, police informants, intimidation, brinkmanship, insane risk-taking, and impassioned speeches from the battlements. And again, Anonymous didn't simply do hacking, but in 2011, a breakaway group called LulzSec, and then after LulzSec, AntiSec, really just were on these unbelievable hacking sprees. For example, LulzSec hacked an organization every day for 50 days in a row. AntiSec, in particular, went after police organizations. They went after NATO in Europe. Every Friday, they had a friendly message for the FBI. And so you can see how they were really getting in the face of law enforcement and taunting them, right? And so this was actually a period of time during my research, because prior to 2011, there really wasn't that much hacking at the hands of Anonymous. And in the summer of 2011, they kind of just went berserk. And I started to become very, very paranoid myself, and was sure that the FBI was going to show up at my doorstep and take all my computers, because maybe I had some good information for them. And so, given this, maybe it won't come as a surprise that there were attempts to label them terrorists. And I'm not going to give you all the examples. I'm just going to kind of maybe highlight the 2 or 3 that I think are more important. But this was a period of time where there was either an explicit attempt or there were gestures at this attempt. And I'm going to highlight one piece in particular that I think was particularly important from the Wall Street Journal that was published in February 2012. And now I'm going to read a small portion that opens the piece. So the piece says, the director of the National Security Agency has warned that the hacking group Anonymous could have the ability within the next year or two to bring about a limited power outage through a cyber attack. General Keith Alexander, the director, provided his assessments in meetings at the White House and in other private sessions, according to people familiar with the gatherings. While he hasn't publicly expressed his concerns about the potential for Anonymous to disrupt power supplies, he has warned publicly about an emergent ability by cyber attackers to disable or even damage computer networks. Now, the T word was never used in this piece. I also think it was completely unsubstantiated with no proof, and I'm going to get to that later in the talk. But nevertheless, by sort of claiming that this was even possible and planting it in a very prominent newspaper, it really put the idea out there that Anonymous could potentially be an extremely dark, menacing force. Similarly, here's a quote from a piece in The New Yorker about Anonymous. And it also concerns whether cyber attackers and terrorists could take down the electrical grid and other cybersecurity threats. I'm not going to read the whole quotes, I'm going to read the bottom part, which basically says, when discussing potential cybersecurity threats by the government was discussing this, we often used Anonymous as Exhibit A. Right? So Anonymous was front and center in the minds of government officials as being a real kind of cybersecurity threat and menace. So now I'm going to turn to why the attempts failed, why weren't more attempts made, which really forms kind of the bulk and the rest of my talk. So one concerns the timing and who and what Anonymous supported in its early activist history. I've talked a bit about the hacking. Anonymous is famous for the hacking, but really, as you'll see, Anonymous is not simply synonymous with hacking. They've taken on many different causes. So in its early history, they went after Scientology, which is a group that many people tend to make fun of, if nothing else, sometimes dislike. They supported piracy. And then in 2010, they rose up in support for WikiLeaks, which really put them on the map and was one reason Anonymous also gained a lot of support. So let me rewind a little bit and go back to November 2010 for those that need a little bit of a refresher. WikiLeaks was given scores of diplomatic cables by Chelsea Manning. And WikiLeaks released this on their websites. And for those who have not read the cables, I actually really recommend it, especially if you're really into ethnographic detail. These cables really go into massive, massive detail about the political situation in these different countries. They're kind of exquisitely written from an academic perspective. So this was extremely controversial, and the US government wasn't pleased that these cables were out in the world. This is Sarah Palin after the cables were released, also quite upset, and sort of making an association between Assange and terrorism. And so this was a moment where the US government was incredibly embarrassed by these cables. It was basically their dirty laundry being shown to the world. And what they did next was very interesting. The US government at the time couldn't arrest Julian Assange. He hadn't, broken any law. And so what they did instead was they convinced MasterCard, PayPal, Amazon, who were servicing WikiLeaks in different ways, to stop providing any services for WikiLeaks. And this was very controversial among people who supported internet rights, even among people who didn't even like WikiLeaks. They felt that there was no sort of reason for the US government to institute this banking blockade, basically. This was a journalist who I think captured the sentiment of the time, who said, of what have either Assange or WikiLeaks actually been convicted that allows Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Amazon to withdraw services this week? So this was a period of time where Anonymous really was a very, very niche phenomena. They were supporting piracy, they were fighting the Church of Scientology, and then they jumped into the fray and supported Julian Assange and protested this banking blockade with a distributed denial of service attack, which is often called a DDoS. And basically, it just means there's too much traffic that goes to a website, and it can't handle the load, and you can't access the websites. And so this put Anonymous on the map, and this was also a really interesting moment, because if this DDoS had been represented as a grave cyber attack, I think Anonymous right away would have been kind of put on a path towards vilification. But interestingly enough, this DDoS was represented in the mainstream media pretty favorably in many of the kind of technology journalism outfits. So now I'm going to actually show a short clip of from CNN, which discusses this attack.
The new 8 o'clock on CNN. Parker Spitzer, weeknights on CNN.
Here's the real meaning of WikiLeaks' story, the powerlessness of world government and institutions in the internet era. In the last few days, supporters of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange have launched Operation Payback, shutting down major websites like Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal. One of the alleged perpetrators is all of 16 years old.
Nick O'Mealy is the perfect person to speak to this new wild, wild net. He's been on the cutting edge of social media and politics. He ran Howard Dean's 2004 presidential internet campaign and teaches about technology and government at Harvard's Kennedy School. It seems a little bit scary to me that anybody can organize an attack on an institution and shut them down. What does that mean?
It's almost like a sit-in, right? I mean, anybody could go sit in the lobby of a bank and shut the bank down for an hour.
That's a fascinating metaphor. I've never even thought about it this way, but it really isn't. I mean, this is a few people. First of all, sit-in requires many people. Second of all, it only shuts down that one little branch. This was right at the heart of the Internet's infrastructure for major global institutions, and they went kaput. And how many people did it take to organize this?
Well, it took a few people to organize it, but hundreds of thousands to participate. It's a denial of service attack. What they do is they get lots of people to all request the website at the same time, and they figure out ways of automating it, but it's still a broad, coordinated activity. PayPal shuts down WikiLeaks' account, but you can still give money through PayPal to the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, this was a political action these hackers took, an act of civil disobedience.
So is this something we should admire?
I absolutely think it's something we should admire. You know, they're standing up for a political value they believe in, which is a radical free speech on the internet. I'd argue maybe it's the only value the internet actually has.
You say you admire them. How far does that go? I mean, cyber war is the new frontier. China is hacking in. China could shut down our grid. Where do you draw the line of what's permissible?
I mean, I wouldn't equate this with cyber war. I don't want,
Why not?
Well, because I don't know that they broke any laws, right?
Well,
all they did was show up.
All they did was show up. All they did was request the website. A lot of people requested the website at once.
If China...
So I love this clip because, first of all, the heart of the internet's economic infrastructure was not attacked. They took down PayPal's blog, which really doesn't even matter for the PayPal payment system. And also, MasterCard and Visa were probably down for 20 minutes here and there. But nevertheless, DDoS is a stunt that allows them to get on the news. And then basically it was very interesting. I was watching at this moment, and while there were, some questions like, is this cyber war? Generally, the experts that were commenting on it were like, no, not at all. This was a protest, it's a nuisance, but by no means is it cyber war. But I think what happened next was even more important, because Anonymous at this point was identified with internet censorship or issues, because Scientology they went after, mostly because Scientology was trying to censor a video of Tom Cruise. Supporting WikiLeaks was really identified with the internet. But what happened next was they got involved in Tunisia. And this really put Anonymous on a path where they started to intervene in social movements around the world. And this was even surprising to Anonymous, because they're like, oh, we thought we were just about internet things, but all of a sudden they were providing assistance to social movements. So in the case of Tunisia, what they did initially was there were protests going on in the streets that people weren't really paying attention to in the West. And Anonymous, first of all, took videos and got them in the hands of journalists who reported on these protests. And then Anonymous also did some kind of other technical things as well on the ground to help Tunisians get information on the ground out of Tunisia. And the impact was pretty profound, so much so that in Tunisia, actually, a lot of people came to love Anonymous. And I'm going to show now a picture of students wearing the Anonymous mask, which they did to thank Anonymous, and then a video where some protesters are thanking Anonymous for their role in contributing to the Tunisian Revolution and the Arab Spring.
Also als erstes möchte ich nochmal im Namen des gesamten tunesischen Volkes in Tunesien, außerhalb Tunesiens, Anonymous danken. Anonymous waren die Einzigen, die uns geholfen haben. Anonymous hat sämtliche Regierungsseiten gesperrt, als sie uns das Internet gesperrt haben, damit wir keine Informationen.
And it didn't stop. In Spain, you had these big revolutions in May, the 15M movements. Anonymous showed up in Wisconsin with their big protests. They are often thought of as being central to the Occupy movement. Interestingly enough, they had nothing to do with the genesis of Occupy, but once Occupy was announced, Anonymous kind of acted as an informal PR wing and started to generate all sorts of really handy posters and videos, and then showed up on the streets and at the camps. And so this, again, I think was really, really important, because Anonymous, again, can't just be pinned down to hacking, because they were contributing to social movements that a lot of people supported, which gets me to my next example. So if I'm sort of claiming who they supported and when was important to prevent this association, I think their flexibility and incoherence also really helps as well. A lot of individuals or groups who get pinned down as terrorists, such as animal rights activists, only do one thing: animal rights activism. Whereas Anonymous is what's called a multiple use name. And this is a term that media scholar Marco Desires has come up with. And what's interesting about Anonymous is that, again, it's a name that anyone can use. So if any of you are excited about Anonymous and feel like you have a political fight tomorrow, you could put on a Guy Fawkes mask, create a video, and you're Anonymous, right? This is how it works. And what's interesting is Anonymous is the most potent example of a multiple use name, but it's by no means the only example of a multiple use name. And so Marco Desires has written a book about different types of multiple use names. Captain Swing was a figure created by the Luddites to lay claim to different actions going on in the UK. The other figure is Luther Blissett, which was created by a small collective of Italian activists. And then the name and the image was taken up by European activists all over the continent to do pranks and lay claim to political actions. And so with a multiple use name, precisely because it could be used to fight rape culture, police brutality, to fight for environmental rights, it's difficult to pin it down because it's everything. And so if it's everything, how can it be terrorism? So I think there's something about the phenomena of the multiple use name that also inoculates Anonymous against this charge. So now I'm going to go to my third example, which is probably my favorite one, which has to do with the adoption of the Guy Fawkes Mask. And this is where actually we get into, I think, some pretty interesting both historical and anthropological territory, because we're dealing with the power of both symbols to regiment reality, the power of people in fiction and art to change symbols, and also the role of masks as well. And so I'll talk a little bit about Guy Fawkes, for those that may not know, but just to make it clear, Anonymous is almost synonymous with Guy Fawkes today. It is really their main symbol. They kind of adopted it sort of accidentally when they were protesting the Church of Scientology on the streets. People felt they should cover their faces because Scientology usually went after its critics and protesters. And so they kind of adopted the mask for practical purposes, but it stuck. And then I think the adoption of this mask became very, very important. But first, let's go back to 1605, in the period of time where Guy Fawkes put 36 barrels of gunpowder to blow up the Parliament. He was a Catholic, the king was Protestant, and there was a big plot to basically behead the entire government and have the Catholics reign, right? I think almost everyone here knows about Guy Fawkes. I've never kind of talked to anyone who didn't know who he was. Now, what's interesting about Guy Fawkes is that, for much of British history, he was really a villainous character. Remember the 5th of November. The whole point of Bonfire Night on November 5th was to remind the British public that Guy Fawkes was something like a terrorist or a terrorist, and that he should be burned at the stake and vilified, right? He didn't have the best reputation. And obviously, Catholics felt otherwise, but I would say the British government, was generally successful in casting him, Guy Fawkes, as a menacing figure. Now let's fast forward to the present moment, and we know, thanks to the graphic novel V for Vendetta, written by Alan Moore, and the Hollywood film, that today Guy Fawkes is a more ambivalent figure, a hero/anti-hero, that has a lot of kind of positive associations, right? It's not simply that he's a straightforward good guy, but definitely he has a different sort of set of associations, and a lot of people actually do look up to V. And these movies and this book had a lot to do with it. But what's interesting about the history of Guy Fawkes is that his reputation started to change earlier than the last 20 or 30 years. And I'm going to just quote Alan Moore, who had something to say about Guy Fawkes that will help us understand how the idea was transformed. So as a mastermind behind the terrorist outrage du jour, however, the plot's nominal leader, Guido Fawkes, rapidly replaced the pontiff as hate mascot of choice on these occasions. Jump forward 300 years, though, to the battered post-war England of the 1950s, and the Saturnine insurrectionary had taken on more ambiguous connotations. When parents explained to their offspring about Guy Fawkes and his attempt to blow up Parliament, there always seemed to be an undertone of admiration in their voices, or at least there did in Northampton. While that era's children perhaps didn't see Fawkes as a hero, they certainly didn't see him as the villainous scapegoat he'd originally been intended as. So then I started to dig in a little bit on the history of Guy Fawkes, and I actually need to do a bit more work on this, but I started to sort of, ask and inquire, well, when and how did he go from being kind of this like super villainous character to something more ambiguous to a kind of full-on hero? Well, some of that transformation started in the 1850s. One of the first books that cast Guy Fawkes in a more positive light was this book, Guy Fawkes or the Gunpowder Treason, historical romance. And then subsequently to that, there were children's books as well that started to kind of recast this character. I've actually started to read the historical novel. It's super boring, but I do need to finish it. But these were like important fictional interventions that started to put Guy Fawkes on a different path. I think what's also interesting and probably really difficult to study, but really interests me quite a bit, is the role of the mask itself. We know from the movie V for Vendetta there's a mask, but actually the mask was bought and sold for the 5th of November, where you could buy the mask in order to create an effigy. And I do wonder whether people started to use the mask and started to kind of identify with Guy Fawkes because they put on his mask. And this is a quote from a piece which has more to do with the movie, but it says, Guy Fawkes, burned at the stake as an effigy on November 5th, by the 19th century came to signify resistance to the emergent disciplinary regime of modern municipal governments. And again, how that came to be, I think is an open question, but I do think it is interesting that the mask was circulated and it wasn't only used to burn the effigy, but people would put on the mask as well, and maybe they would become Guy Fawkes. So this leads me to another interesting question, which I can't really answer, but the term guy, like, hey, you guy over there, come here, comes from Guy Fawkes, right? So Guy means a man, and it also is a figure representing Guy Fawkes burned on bonfire on Guy Fawkes night. And those definitions should actually be turned around, because first you had the historical figure who then became the more general term. And I need to do some research as to how that happened, but that's fascinating because there's a way in which anonymous, anyone can be anonymous, and Guy Fawkes, who is this historical figure, became this name for any guy, right? So this is all mysterious stuff that I have to kind of dive into. But nevertheless, by the time you get to the movie V for Vendetta, I think that transformation fully is in place. Guy Fawkes is way more of a positive figure, and there's also this idea that anyone can be Guy Fawkes, and you really get that at the end of the movie, where there's a character, Evie, and so 1 year after Parliament is demolished, because it's demolished in the movie, V destroys the eye, ear, mouth, allowing the citizens of Britain the freedom to do whatever they wish. V dies while attempting to destroy Downing Street, an act that Evie completes. She then assumes the mask, costume, and role of her mentor, V. Again, because of the mask, you can become the character. And then I think that there's other really interesting elements about the Guy Fawkes mask and Anonymous. Again, Anonymous took the mask accidentally. They weren't sort of thinking, oh, we're trying to recreate the movie. But given the fact that Anonymous often was fighting censorship and surveillance, that was one of their core issues, there's a way in which the movie's themes mapped on well to historical reality, so much so that then anonymous protesters would take quotes from the movie and bring them to their street protests. And again, Anonymous is a phenomena that encompasses everything from hacking to street protests. But I think the street protests are particularly important in this story because if you have a kind of historical character like Guy Fawkes, right? He really lived. He was a historical figure. He was memorialized in fiction and film. And then Anonymous comes along and takes on the masks, and so takes what is something semi-historical, semi-fictional, and then brings it to the plane of material reality through protests. And I'm now going to show you an image that I just was shown today, which is kind of remarkable, which is the British government has a picture of Guy Fawkes as a hacker. And so it says, today all he would need is a computer. And so they're actually trying to reassert control over the symbol by sort of saying, no, Guy Fawkes is a terrorist, and today, a hacker can be a terrorist. But I actually think that they've lost control of the symbol, and even though they're trying with this kind of fancy poster, Anonymous nevertheless has really used the symbol, and so that it symbolizes revolutionary protest, right? And again, I think this sort of cycle of history to fiction to then, another new chapter of reality is fascinating. And I'll have a little bit more to say about then how Anonymous is fictionalized, which is my next point, is that Anonymous is now part of the cultural zeitgeist thanks to popular, high, low, and esoteric culture. So if Guy Fawkes was fictionalized in children's books, in novels, in graphic novels, and in movies, and that was the medium, one of the mediums through which Guy Fawkes was recalibrated as a kind of heroic figure, well, now Anonymous is being fictionalized like crazy. And I gave a few examples, but there's really so many of them. So one of the ones that I like the most is a German film called Who Am I? No System is Safe, which is actually an excellent, excellent film about computer hacking and hacktivism, really one of the best films I've ever seen. And there's a group called Clay, which is masked, and they're literally trying to outdo Anonymous in the film. And so that's one example. Another example where you just have references to Anonymous is a film called Dope, which is about some geek kids living in Inglewood, California, where you just have like small little references to Anonymous. Another example is The Good Wife, a TV show that has references to Anonymous. Ballet in Boston was made that was based on Anonymous as well. And in London, you had a play called The Internet is Serious Business, and the is actually spelled that way. And Royal Court Theatre is one of the oldest theatre houses in London, and there's this entire kind of play based on Anonymous. And so this, again, I think is really significant because in all these different media, Anonymous tends to be portrayed as kind of heroic figures, and so then it becomes a little bit harder to sort of portray them through other channels as demonic figures. So now I just have two more examples, two more reasons why I think it was hard to portray Anonymous as terrorists. And one has to do with terrorists, ISIS in particular. So ISIS was really interesting because of how they use social media to recruit people and also circulate imageries of their violence. So right at the period where ISIS was circulating images and videos of their beheadings, you also had Anonymous circulating their own videos. And in some ways, they were kind of incomparable, right? Where you had actual violence, really gruesome forms of violence, with then, these masked characters sort of saying, we're going to show up and protest police brutality. And in fact, I think in most people's minds, people think Anonymous is like, the kid that still lives with his mom. And I actually don't think that's right. There's a lot more diversity to Anonymous than that picture implies. But in people's heads, I think the stereotype of the sort of fat white nerd helped, because if you contrasted it to sort of the terrorist figure, they're in some ways really diametrically opposed. And so Anonymous was popular just at the time where terrorists were using social media to circulate their images. And then the next thing that happened was that Anonymous actually started operations against terrorists when terrorists attacked in Paris against Charlie Hebdo at first, and then the Paris attacks on the streets that had happened not long after. And so you have this moment where people took the name, and actually it was a kind of new group of people that took on the name. There were ex-military and military types who took the name Anonymous, which you could sort of tell by the buff figure of that person holding the machine gun. It was a kind of different type of imagery. But once Anonymous was fighting the terrorists, it became that much harder to label Anonymous the terrorist as well. But that didn't happen until 2015. So now I'm going to really wrap up and finish with a single event that I think was particularly important in this history. And it concerns the Anti-Counterfeit Trade Agreement, which is a multilateral trade agreement that different nations around the world were seeking to ratify. And the details don't really matter, except to know that it was very, very unpopular among internet and geeky types because it would have made copyright more restrictive, and it would have allowed for kind of more forms of internet censorship. And so this treaty was being considered in many different countries, but there were huge protests in Poland against it in particular. 10,000 protesters showed up on the streets to protest ACTA, and Anonymous then launched an operation. And this is the opening call, which said, "Welcome to Operation Anti-ACTA. We encourage you to spread the word of anti-ACTA far and wide. The top priority is to steal and leak any classified government information, including emails and documentation. Prime targets are Polish government websites and other high-ranking establishments." And so what Anonymous was doing was engaging in distributed denial of service attacks. They were supporting the protesters on the ground. And then this happened. A group of Polish parliamentarians who opposed ACTA took on the Guy Fawkes Mask to register their protest of ACTA. And it didn't pass, actually. The ACTA wasn't ratified by the Polish government. And so what I'm going to show you now is a blog post by someone anonymous who basically wrote, "Anonymous is not unanimous. An opinion on DDoS is perhaps more divided than any other tactic. Indeed, this very faction, in consultation with anti-ACTA NGOs, has been calling for a halt to DDoS for the last several days. But after this photo of Polish politicians protesting ACTA went viral yesterday, it's time we all reevaluate the role and legitimacy of DDoS. These parliamentarians were wearing anonymous Guy Fawkes masks, while the Parliament's website was down to DDoS by Anonymous. We can't emphasize the point enough. This is a game changer." I think it was also a game changer for how it legitimated the tactics, which the blog post talked about, the collective and the icon as well. When you have government officials taking on the very icon of this group, it's very difficult to call that group and its icon terrorists as a result. So wasn't that surprising to me when 2 weeks later, the Wall Street Journal article came out claiming that Anonymous had the ability to take down the power grid? And again, I was surprised because there was no evidence whatsoever that ever existed that they would ever want to do this, in part because they rely on electricity for their own organizing. And yeah, killing people or any loss of life is never part of their kind of motivation. And this was a really, important moment. Of course, I have no proof whatsoever that this was kind of in response to what had happened in Poland, but there was no proof to the article. It did feel like a bit of government propaganda. And it was a real kind of concerted effort that never panned out either. This was 2012, and nothing of the sort ever panned out. So what happened next? Well, a lot of security experts, a lot of hackers, different types of hackers, those that are about securing systems, talked to the media and basically said, you know what, Anonymous doesn't have that capability and they're not interested in that. And that claim kind of fell flat on its feet, and basically the winds were taken out of that sail, and that was the kind of end of story. So what I'm going to do now is basically finish. I think that there's some really interesting stakes to this story. as a kind of cultural anthropologist who cares about, the social life of symbols, I do think that they matter. And that's why I'm so fascinated by the Guy Fawkes symbol and how he went from being this kind of uber terrorist to heroic figure to an icon that was taken up by a social movement, to further kind of protest movements that then is being adopted in fictionalized media like ballet, like plays, and like film. I think the realm of culture, arts, and symbols do matter in terms of how we perceive things, because Anonymous, which I can't necessarily support all their actions, but I do think that they've done some interesting things. If they had just been disabled immediately because they had been tagged terrorists, you can see how that kind of rhetorical play would have profound effects. And so I think it's really important to understand in this case and learn from how groups can try to prevent the attempt to disable these political movements through being tagged as terrorists. So I'm just going to leave it at that, and I welcome any comments or questions about this or Anonymous in general. Thank you very much.